Okay, I wanted to give you guys a quick introduction on importing assets into Unity for use in game production. This is going to be a fairly straightforward lesson. I just want to give you a good idea of some things that you can do when you're importing assets and how to kind of set up a good workflow to make sure that everything you're doing is sort of logical and easy to work with. So um, I have two assets. I have my wall and my floor pieces that I'm going to be bringing into Unity. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the wall piece. And there's a couple of things I want to check out for before I continue too far. I want to make sure that my object is actually at 0, 0, 0 on the coordinate grid. So if it's somewhere around like this, it's probably not going to be as optimized. So um, whether you're using Max or Maya, you just want to make sure that you've zeroed out those transformations. And in Maya, you want to make sure that you do go to modify freeze transformations. In Max, that would be a reset X form modifier, and then you would collapse it. And then you also in Maya want to go to edit delete all by type history to make sure that you have everything cleared out and you have kind of a clean export. I have my outliner open here just to double check that the model that I'm exporting has is named correctly and doesn't have any additional junk transforms anywhere. And I'm going to open up my attribute editor really quickly to take a look at my um, material. So it's called M for material underscore wall. That's just a naming convention I like to use. That's completely optional. Then I have my color is my texture asset for my albedo, and then my bump mapping is my normal map. So it all displays correctly here in Maya. If it was in Max, you would just hit M on the keyboard to bring up your material selection and make sure you have a correctly assigned material with at least a diffuse and a normal or bump. So this looks like it's all pretty much in order. And if you take a look at my files, I have a few scenes that I'm working with. I have my floor, I have my wall, and then the full scene we're going to address at the end of the lecture. And then I have a folder called textures, which has all of these textures. So I have my albedo, my normals, and my ambient occlusion. The normals and ambient occlusion were just baked from XNormal, and I didn't do anything particularly special with that. I just did a simple texture painting job on my albedo. Um, okay, really, we should be pretty good to go. All I have to do is with the wall selected, I'm going to go to export selection. Now, I always use export selection because a lot of times in my assets, I'm going to have several pieces. So for example, I have my ZBrush asset here and I have my envelope and I don't want to export those to Unity. So I'm just going to go to export selection. And I already had this kind of preloaded, but I'm going to select my floor. And there's a couple of things I want to watch out for. I don't need to have tangents and binormals. I don't need to have smooth mesh. Reference assets content is a good idea. Smoothing groups, make sure you have smoothing groups checked. And then under animation, if you don't have any animation that you're exporting with this, just don't check animation. That makes things a tiny bit simpler. Other than that, you really don't have to worry too much about any of the options here. And then you can just go ahead and export that asset. Okay, so now I'm going to open up Unity really quick, and I'm going to kind of get up so that I can start working with this. So I have a completely blank Unity project. It was just set up for the default 3D, so it comes in with the 3D skybox. But I don't have anything else in here, so I'm going to go ahead and in my project folder, I'm going to make a new folder. And this folder, you could call it the art folder, or you could call it the models folder. For right now, I'm going to call it art. I think that's probably a good way to handle it. And then I'm going to make another folder called scenes. That's where we're going to save our scenes. So in my art folder. I'll probably usually, when I'm working on a game project, I'll actually make subfolders for this. So I'll have things like based on regions and types of assets. But for this, for right now, I think I'm just going to make a folder called architecture. And then inside that folder called architecture, I'm going to actually make another folder, and this is a little bit interesting, but it'll make sense to you soon. I'm going to call it underscore source assets. Now, in the source assets folder is actually where I'm going to import all of my textures and models. So we exported the wall, and we exported these textures. So I'm going to go ahead and actually I'm going to just drag the textures folder and the wall, and I'm going to drag both of those together into the source assets folder. Now it says that I have a normal map that is not listed as a normal map, so you can just hit fix now. Basically that allows you to bring in the asset correctly. And there we go. So yeah, I actually just dragged my wall model outside of the project into the scene, and it looks pretty good. The only thing I don't have here, you'll notice that the one thing that might not be ideal is that your material is actually coming in as T-wall albedo, which is actually the name of the albedo texture. So there's a few ways you can modify the way that you import assets. So I'm going to click on the wall. I'm going to make sure I have my rig type as none, and I have animations. It says it's set to import animations. I don't need to have that checked. I'll go ahead and apply that. Now under model, most of the things here will usually be okay by default. If you worked in a different scale in Maya or Max than what Unity was expecting, you can adjust the scale factor. So for example, my asset was already set to be the right size in centimeters. But if I found that it came in really small, I could try doing like a scale factor of 10 or 100 or something like that. Similarly, I could do a scale factor of 0.00 or a 0.01 if, like, say it was expecting meters, but I brought in centimeters. Now, all of these other things are relevant in various ways, but I usually leave generate colliders, swap UVs, and generate lightmap UV off. If you're doing light maps, you usually actually want to make one manually, but if you don't have light maps, which in this case I don't believe that we do, you can just go ahead and check that box. Now, it won't actually create a very high quality light map. What you would want to do in your 3D package is you would want to actually create a light map yourself, but that's a little bit outside of the scope of this lecture, so it's nothing that you really have to worry about too much. So I actually always import usually import normals is fine. I don't usually actually export tangents. It's not really a big deal, so I just hit calculate and that's fine. Most of the other things that I select here are fine. The only thing that I always want to change is I actually don't like the material name by being by base texture name. I really would prefer it be using the model's material. So if I hit apply there, now you'll see that the material that came in actually has the correct name. Now the only thing that's a little bit of a pain is that if you do update that, you can go ahead and just delete the old material so you don't have a redundant material there. Now there's also scripts that you can write that are pretty straightforward that actually change that default to from models material. I usually think that that's a good idea, but that's up to you. Now, there's one other thing that you want to watch out before you start working with this asset. So I'm going to drag this slider here so that it's not showing a preview. It's just showing the file types. Now, what you're looking at here, this kind of blue cube with a white piece of paper, is indicating that this is an actual model import or an FBX import. Now, if you click on this, it shows all the information for your model imports. But what is actually sort of a little bit complicated, and not everybody understands this right away, is that you don't actually want to drag this into your scene because it's not a very functional version of your model. You want everything that you put into Unity to be a prefab, because prefabs you can actually make changes to after the fact and then apply those changes. So what I usually do is really, really straightforward. I drag the first one out into an empty scene like this. So I have that wall model there. I zero out the transforms, hit F to focus on it. So it has a position, rotation, and a scale all kind of at their default values. Now I need to actually set this up so that it has collision, but the only way that I can do that is by making it a prefab. Otherwise, I'd have to set up the collision individually each time I do it. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a component, and in this case I'm going to go to physics, and then I want to use a box collider. So this is one of the most basic versions of colliding with objects that you can do. You just add a box collider, and then it kind of conforms to the shape of the asset. So those are usually pretty good. If you put a box collider on the same layer that has a mesh renderer, then it'll usually build it correctly pretty quickly. So, but then now, because I want to save that box collider, I'm just going to actually go one layer up from this source assets folder into my architecture folder, and I'm going to drag the wall over to here. And now you'll notice that it doesn't have that blue paper icon on it. That's because it's now a prefab. So the way that you can check that something is or is not a prefab is if it has this select, revert, and apply button instead of when it's just a model. If you just drag out a model, it has select, revert, and open, which is how you can tell that it's not a prefab and you won't be able to apply changes to it. So now, in this case, I, for example, wanted to make sure this was static. So static gives me the ability to bake light maps and things like that with this. And it turns kind of a bold highlighted color to show me that it's not applied to the prefab yet. So I can just go ahead and apply that. And then every time I have a new version of the model, it will also be static. And then if I go to my architecture and I drag out another mesh, this will also be static because we set it up as a prefab. So always everything that you place in Unity should be a prefab. And that's a pretty strict, hard and fast rule for getting these things to work properly. Because otherwise you just don't have enough control over it. So all right, let's go ahead and import another asset. So we'll go to our next one, the floor mesh. And so this one is actually a little bit more complicated because I wanted to bring it in with LODs. And there's actually a really cool shortcut for getting objects to have LODs. And I also made a custom collision, and I'll show you how that kind of works. So first of all, the reason that the LODs will come in automatically is because of this naming convention, which is that we have the name of the mesh, and then it has underscore LOD0 and underscore LOD1. So LOD0 is always the highest detail version, and then LOD1 is the next one down, and then LOD2 would be the next one after that, and so on. So this one, I also have my modeling resources folder. I'm just going to hide that. And one thing that I want to watch out for too is, so my collision is just really a simple cube. And I made it to fit the shape that I wanted this to be. This cube is just for an example. So when you build objects that are more complicated than this, you would have probably more complicated collision meshes. But usually what you want the collision mesh to be is the simplest representation of it that you can have without losing gameplay functionality. So for example, an archway would just be a shape that's like the size of the top of the arch and the sides of the arch. But I'm going to go ahead and actually I'm going to select all three of these assets, the floor LOD0, floor LOD1, and floor collisions. And I'm going to export selection. Now, there's actually new buttons in Maya 2016 for send to Unity and send to Unreal. These are pretty cool, and you can mess around with them if you have a version of Maya that supports it. But because it's fundamentally the same kind of process no matter what you do, I'm not personally super concerned about doing it that way. So I'm going to go ahead and export selection, and I'm going to go make sure I'm using an FBX, and I've got all the settings I want. I think they should be the same from last time. And I'm going to go to my floor, and I'm going to export selection. Now, this time, instead of dragging directly into the project file, I'm actually going to drag it into the Windows display of the same assets. So if I go to Art, I have in mine I have users, Tristan, documents, Unity projects, and I have my import project. And then you can find all of the assets that are in your project here. So I'm going to go to the architecture, source assets, and then I'm just going to drag the export from my reference folder into here. And I'm just going to make a copy of it. And then what you'll notice is that that will actually bring it in automatically. And then I can go and I can check, just like what I did with the last one. I can go to floor, and I can just change it to models material, just so that the name is more accurate. And then I can delete the extra one. Now, if you wanted to, you could also just make it like your albedo just had a basic name that didn't denote that it was an albedo. But that's one of the reasons that I don't like doing it that way, is because I think it's a little bit dirtier as far as figuring out what's going on. So, okay, so now this time, instead of dragging it out into the scene, I'm going to drag it out into the hierarchy. Now, there's no reason you have to drag it out into the hierarchy. Oops, actually that was the wall. Dragged out the wall instead. I should drag out the floor. Now, you don't have to drag it out into the hierarchy or into the scene. Either one works. Basically, just comes down to preference of what you want to do. When you drag things out into the hierarchy, it always defaults to at the floor. But what's really cool is you'll notice that it has this LOD group. And this LOD group was created automatically because of the way that we set up our naming for our objects. So if you look at LOD 0, it actually has the floor, the higher poly floor, which is 64 triangles. And then if you go to LOD 1, it has the lower poly floor, which is actually just a cube, which has 12 triangles. And then if you go really far away, it actually culls the asset. So if you want to preview what that looks like, you can actually just move between the assets by nudging back and forth between them. But the other thing that is, if we expand this object in the hierarchy, we'll notice that it also has the collision mesh. And that's not something that we want to include because we're actually using the collision for a separate purpose. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the collision mesh, and it says this action will break the prefab instance. Are you sure you want to continue? I said okay. And then I'm going to, in the same way that I did with the last one, I'm going to go up one level so I'm not in my source assets folder. And I'm going to drag the floor out to make it a prefab. And now I can actually add a mesh collider that uses that collision mesh. So I'm going to go and select Physics Mesh Collider. And then under Mesh, what I can do is I can just browse for or search for floor collisions. And I usually prefer to read it, but that's up to you. So then if I put in floor collisions, then the floor works exactly how I need it to work without having any additional efforts. Now, so this is a good example of something that we may have to do quite often. which is I notice here that if I have the floor like this, where actually the collider is slightly below the level of the floor, that's actually not going to work out too well for me because objects will appear to kind of like drop through it because I made the mistake, and I did this on purpose for illustration purposes, but I made the mistake of thinking that this asset would work better if I had it as just the same shape as the lower LOD, which actually flattens it down further. And that's not going to work too well. So what I want to do is I want to make a small change to it. So I'm going to jump back into my Maya scene. I'm going to go to my collision geometry. I'm going to switch to selecting components. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, while snapping to vertex, and this would be V on the keyboard, or you would press S in Max to enable snapping, and then you could snap it up to match the top. Now that I have that, I'm actually going to have to export this again because I made this correction here, and that should actually work just fine, except I need to go ahead and export that selection again. So there's a few ways I can do this. I can go and I can just export it to the floor asset that I already had, and then I can go and I can overwrite it by opening up Windows, not Unity, and dragging my floor asset back over here, and then I can replace it. And then if I go back into Unity, then I will have that working correctly, and it'll actually update in real time. But so go ahead and save my scene. Test scene. Okay, so so yeah, you'll see here that the floor collision is now updated so that it actually matches the top instead of the bottom. And that's something that you really want to do at all times. Now, you could even go a little bit further with this and save yourself a step by, rather than exporting it into kind of like a transitional folder, you could actually export it directly into the folder where you want the final content to appear. Now, you do have to be really, really careful about this because you have to make sure that things maintain the same names or you'll start breaking connections to your assets in Unity. But okay, so we got this mesh collider working. And really, that should be pretty straightforward. So just to give you kind of a summary of how some of this stuff works, LOD groups do not have to be created this way. You can actually create an LOD group manually. So I'm just going to quickly go through and set that up for you so that you can see how it works. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the LOD component. And then what happens is that you'll notice that both of these start to show at the same time. Which is expected, but basically what you need when you have an LOD group in Unity is you need to have a parent object that controls the functionality of the LOD, and then you need to have the child objects underneath it. And ultimately, it's pretty flexible as far as how you do it. The naming convention is to make it apply faster, but you actually don't need to use those naming conventions. And you can also put things in groups so they don't have to all be combined into one asset. But let's just recreate that LOD group so you can see how it works. So I always try to filter, so I typed in the word LOD, and then I can add an LOD group that way. And this defaults to having 3 LODs, and then it also has a culling distance that's probably a little bit too close. So what we want to do is we want to quickly add the LODs to the groups. So we have LOD 0. I'm actually just going to drag LOD 0 over the add button. And then I'm going to go to LOD 1 and I'm going to drag that one out. And then for LOD 2, we actually don't, actually, I dragged it to the wrong one. For LOD2, we actually don't want that at all, so we're going to go ahead and delete it. Now, when you delete LODs, you have to make adjustments for placement. So you want to make sure. And this is what's cool, actually, is because it shows you when you drag the direction, or when you drag the middle connection between these, it'll show you actually literally at which point, which distance it starts to transition. So you can see how big the object is when the transition happens. And this is based on screen percentages, or size based on percentages. So it's fairly intuitive once you get a little bit used to it. So you may be a little bit thrown by it at first, but it really makes sense. It's not based on distance because it's really based on how big the object is. And that way you can have a more uniform structure for every asset. Okay, so now we've got our LOD group and it works fine. There's a couple of different options for fades, and crossfade is just basically allowing you to transition between them and kind of do like a dithering effect. Usually that costs a little bit more performance, so I turn it off unless there's any reason I specifically need to use it. And then I'm going to turn this on to be static as well, because I want to make sure that I can get good results. So then I'm going to go ahead and apply this. And then I'm going to basically just start assembling a small scene with this, and I want to give you some tips on doing that. So the main thing is you hit Control D to duplicate assets, and then if you hold down Control while you're moving or rotating objects, they will snap to a grid. If you want to adjust that grid, you can go to Edit, Snap Settings, and you can change what the move, rotate, and scale snap is. Defaults to 1 meter and 15 degrees of rotation. So for example, I can duplicate this one and then hit Control and rotate it, and I can start making assets that look like they're sort of making sense. Now, in this case, I actually want to, I think that'll probably be okay. So just go through. I'm going to quickly make like a small sort of hallway mesh. Now, I'm actually going to make like an intersection here, and I'm actually just, this is usually how I work when I'm putting things together, is because I want to try to like reduce the amount of friction that I have in building my scenes. I do a lot of duplicating, so I'm hitting Control and duplicating assets as much as I can. And you can also grab groups of objects and duplicate them together, so I can add a few different assets here. And so now obviously this is a very simple example, so I'm not really like doing anything that's too extreme, but this does give you a decent idea of how this process will work, so that you can follow that through with your own assets in the future. And now you'll notice that there's this little readout in the bottom, which is showing you information about light baking processes. Now that's something that you don't necessarily have to worry about too much, but if you want to edit lighting, you can go to Window Lighting, and there's a bunch of options here for baking lighting. It defaults to turning lighting bake to auto, so it'll bake every time you make a change. And it'll only bake assets that have static flags. So, but what's kind of cool about that is we can adjust certain aspects of how Unity handles lighting, because it actually creates a bounce light effect even with your dynamic lighting. And if you go to your light, your directional light in the scene, you can adjust bounce intensity, and you'll see a more extreme reaction there. And that's something that's pretty cool. And we used light maps to get that to happen. So doing my generated light maps, that'll probably work fine for now, but in the future you might want to do something more manually, and I can do a separate tutorial in the future on that. But yeah, so this gives you something to work with initially as far as how this gets set up. And it's also cool because you can still adjust the position of the light dynamically, and it'll update the light bounces in real time, which looks pretty cool. If you want to add new lights to your scene, you can just go to Game Object and select Light, and then there's options for directional light, point light, spotlight, and area light. Now, area lights are only baked, but I'm going to say, for example, I'm going to add a point light here, and I'm actually just going to put one at the end of the hall and make it look like it's kind of. I might like put a brazier or something like that to make that look more believable in my final scene. But I just want to show you some lighting, and so I can change the color of the light, and that's just by selecting the light component. And then I can go and I can adjust the range so that it's influencing more. And then the last thing I want to do, because I'm a big fan of Unity's new lighting setup, is I really want to show you how to set up some basic lighting features for reflections and all of that kind of business. So also keep in mind that even point lights also allow you to increase the bounce intensity and all of that kind of stuff. So if you want them to be brighter, you can do that too. So I'm going to make a reflection probe and give you a quick explanation of how that works. So I'm going to go to Light, Game Object, Light, and Reflection Probe. And my reflection probe, basically what you're doing is you're trying to get information from the scene that will make your scene look more accurate and reflective. So there's a few different ways you can handle that. But basically it has, this reflection probe has a cube shape, and everything inside of the cube shape will be influenced by the probe. So you'll notice that there's like a more generic reflection on the outside of the probe, but on the inside it's a little bit more specific. So I'm going to actually show you quickly how to use box projection, because that works really well in this case. So I'm going to go ahead and actually just click on this kind of like lines connecting these dots here. That'll allow me to edit the shape of the reflection probe. And I'm actually just going to, you can hold down Control while you're dragging this, and it'll make a more snapped selection, so it'll snap to the grid. And I'll drag this out so it's including everything. And I'm just kind of trying to get that accurate as I can get it within the time constraints. Actually, I also need to make it go down that hallway. So in this case, I know because there's a little cool trick for making this kind of shape look cool, is I'm actually going to go to my reflection probe. I'm just going to hit Control D to make a new version of the reflection probe, and then I'm going to edit this. And I'm actually going to snap it so that it's kind of just following the end of the hallway. So let's see, there we go. Now, one thing to keep in mind is you may actually have to do some rebaking. So Unity doesn't have a button for rebaking automatically. It should update the bake, but if you don't see it update, you can actually just swap the bake type from baked to custom and then back to bake, and that should activate it. You can also, if you're doing it in real time, that is another option. But so now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make some tweaks here. So I'm going to turn on box projection for both of my reflection probes. And now, because I want to I want to actually get to see what's happening a little bit better. I'm going to adjust the material on the floor mesh. So I can go and I can click on the floor and then go to like LOD 0, and then I can expand the material that we're looking at here. Now, one thing that we didn't do yet is we didn't set up our occlusion maps. So we actually have, I'm going to want to drag some textures in here. So I'm actually going to hold down, I'm just going to actually click on this lock icon on the inspector. And then I'm going to go to textures. And I'm going to drag my floor occlusion over. And that just makes it look kind of a little bit darker in the recesses, which is kind of a cool thing. And then actually, I'm going to unlock that real quick. I'm going to select my wall. I'm going to lock that one too. Now, you don't have to lock them. So you just have to be careful that you don't click and release on one of the textures. So for example, actually, I'll leave this one unlocked. And I'll, with my wall selected, I'll just go to my wall occlusion and drop that in. And as long as I don't click and release on the wall occlusion texture first, it'll populate that. And then you'll notice that it just it creates this kind of subtle shading effect in areas that are closely connected. And that's the same thing that you see on this mesh too. It's just a little bit of shading where objects are recessed or close together. And that makes it look better. The more complicated the asset, the better it actually looks usually. But so, okay, I want to go ahead and increase the smoothness a little bit on this asset so that you can see the reflections better. And I'm going to make it probably a little bit extreme just because I really want to show you what's happening with those reflection probes. And so what's cool is that in the reflection probe, it's like because we're doing this box projection, it actually creates what looks like the shape of the box that we just projected, which is essentially making it look like we're accurately reflecting the walls of the scene, which is pretty awesome, I must say. It's very cool to see that happening. And I'm actually going to go and I think that maybe the walls are a little bit too reflective. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to reduce that smoothness a little bit down. Now you can also make a map for metallic and smoothness. Since this is just a very simple introduction, I think that that's something that could take a whole lecture on or a whole class on. So I'm not going to discuss too much about the aspects of the metallic smoothness maps. But at a basic level, smoothness is controlling how reflective objects look. So see, this is really reflective here, and this is like a little bit less reflective. And then a map would just allow you to control that differently on different parts of the object. But yeah, so okay. Now, I think, honestly, this is a pretty straightforward intro lesson for getting assets into Unity and getting them to start looking cool and working well. Now, there's only one other thing that I really wanted to cover for this. So I'm going to go ahead and save my scene. I'm going to open up a new scene. And there are situations where it's actually a good idea to import a pre-built scene. Now, there are some limits for this. This is something I'll discuss just in general. Let me see, I just want to make sure I have the my scene set up correctly here. So if you have a full scene like this, and you want to just import the entire scene, you can do that, and I'll just show you how. So I can go and in the same way that I did everything else, I can actually okay, so I just quickly saved that. So I've got a lot of these assets here, and the naming is a little bit off, but I'm going to select all of the assets that I wanted to actually export, which in this case, I'm actually going to delete that so that I can actually export the entire scene. Now, sometimes I've actually worked on some games where this is actually how we did it. We just exported an entire scene from Maya directly into Unity. This is also one thing that Unity kind of has as an advantage over other tools like Unreal, because you can't really pick this option. If you wanted to do it in Unreal, it's a little bit harder to do. Um, so, okay, so I'm going to go export full scene FBX. And then I'm going to drag that full scene FBX into my source assets. And there's a couple of good things to note about this. One of them is that it actually can pull references from the other textures and materials that you already made. But like, so okay, then I'm going to go ahead and drop this into my my scene. And so it defaulted to using the same materials that it defaulted to using the materials that it created itself. So I can actually go ahead and just change that again. And I can go to from models material. And then it'll actually probably pull the actual materials that were already there. So I can actually delete those M floor albedo and M wall albedo. But yeah, so I was able to bring this in as a default scene, and now it's not perfect. Like, it doesn't have everything that I might want it to have. But what I could then do is I could essentially work with my scene as if it were a Maya file, and then just export that FBX, and then all of the content would be fully propagated into the scene. Now, there are some limitations for this, one of them being that you can't use instances, and you can't share prefabs without doing some scripting to set this up. But I know a lot of you, when you're just starting out or working on small projects and things, you might just want to say, okay, I really worked on this scene in Maya, I want to bring it into Unity, and this is a pretty straightforward way to do that. So you can get a complicated scene running in the game engine pretty quickly. So then the other thing that you can do, because I think this is worthwhile to note, is let me delete that scene real quick. And I'm going to go to generate colliders and hit apply. And then what that'll do is it'll actually generate a mesh collider for every object that was in here. So each of the walls and floors will have a mesh collider that's just using the mesh itself. And then if you want to optimize a mesh collider to make it a little bit more efficient, you can go and select convex, and that'll flatten it out a little bit so that it's a little bit neater. Now, again, this is one thing that's challenging about setting up assets this way, is this process is a lot more destructive, and without writing scripting for it, it's going to be a lot more challenging. So I do want to somewhat caution against this, because this is sort of like an advanced technique that you really can't take full advantage of if you're not super sure how to get it to work. So I tend to just export individual assets and assemble my scene in Unity, because there's a lot of stuff that works better when you're doing it that way. But this is something that is a valid option, and there's definitely shipped games that I've worked on that have done it this way. So, but you usually have to get some engineering support to make sure that you're like updating the scene properly, and that you're not losing content, and that you can still apply colliders and things that will mix and match. You can often actually, one option for this, and this is something that's worth noting, and in a more detailed lecture, I could tell you how to do this, but you can actually drop a full scene template into Unity from Maya or Max, and write a script that will replace like all of these floor meshes with a floor prefab that you pre-assemble. And then basically at that point, what it serves the purpose for is essentially like allowing you to speed block out a level. And that's actually a pretty valid way of doing it if you wanted to start out by getting like your core scene represented in your 3D package, and then moving it over to Unity and be able to work with that. But that's a little bit outside of this lesson. So, okay, so then the last thing that I want to show you how to do is just a really straightforward, which is just getting your scene to be playable. So I'm going to jump back to my test scene, and I'm not going to worry about this full scene for right now. So I'm going to not save that. So if you want to play your scene in first person, all you have to do is go to Assets, Import Package, and then you want to go to Characters. And this should be the correct one. Yes, all right. And then you can just import this this standard asset. It just takes a second. Okay. And then once you have that there, you can actually go to your standard assets, go to characters, first person character, go to prefabs. And then drag the FPS controller into the scene. Now, you want to make sure that you're using the FPS camera, so you can go ahead and delete the main camera from the scene, and then you'll just have the FPS character with the camera. And then you can go ahead and hit play, and then you'll be able to walk around in your environment. And since we have the assets all set up with collision, we can actually walk around and we can explore the environment. So yeah, I mean, really, that's the beginning kind of intro to getting assets into Unity, and making sure they follow proper convention and that they're set up in a way that you can easily edit in the future. Every time I make assets, I make them and integrate them in basically the same kind of pipeline. So I think that hopefully this clears up little errors or confusion about how bringing assets into Unity is supposed to work and how you work with prefabs and all that kind of stuff. Unity is really straightforward, but because it's so straightforward, it doesn't always get a lot of explanation for the things that are being done. So hopefully that helps, and we can move forward with making more complicated and interesting scenes in Unity. So I'm going to wrap up that lesson right there, and then I'll make another tutorial on basically doing the same kind of thing, only in Unreal Engine 4 instead of Unity. All right, thanks for watching.